Part 3, Chapter 4, The Archipelago Hardens. And the clock of history was striking. In 1933, at the January session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the great leader, who at the time was already computing the number of two-legged beings who had yet to be exterminated in the country, declared that the dying off of the state, so firmly promised by Lenin and fervently expected by humanists, would not come about through weakening the state, but on the contrary through strengthening it to the utmost, which was necessary in order to kill off the moribund classes. This was so unexpectedly brilliant that it was not given to every little mind to grasp it, but Vyshinsky, ever the loyal apprentice, immediately picked it up, and this means the maximum strengthening of corrective labor institutions, entry into socialism via the maximum strengthening of prison. And this was not some satirical magazine cracking a joke either, but was paid for by the Prosecutor General of the Soviet Union. And an iron curtain descended around the archipelago. No one other than the officers and sergeants of the NKVD could enter and leave via the camp gatehouse. That harmonious order of things was established which the zeks themselves would soon come to consider the only conceivable one. And that is when the wolf's fangs were bared, and that is when the bottomless pit of the archipelago gaped wide. I'll shoe you in tin cans, but you're going out to work. If there aren't enough railroad ties, I'll make one out of you. They say that in February to March 1938, a secret instruction was circulated in the NKVD. Reduce the number of prisoners. And not by releasing them, of course. I do not see anything in the least impossible here. This was a logical instruction because there was simply not enough housing, clothing, or food. Gulag was grinding to a halt from exhaustion. And this was when the pellagra victims lay down and died en masse. This was when the chiefs of convoy began to test the accuracy of machine gun fire by shooting at the stumbling zeks. And this was when every morning the orderlies hauled the corpses to the gatehouse, stacking them there. In the Kolyma, that pole of cold and cruelty in the archipelago, that very same about-face took place with a sharpness worthy of a pole. According to the recollections of Ivan Semyonovich KarpunichBraven, former commander of the 40th Division and of the 12th Corps, who recently died with his notes incomplete and scattered, a most dreadfully cruel system of food, work, and punishment was established in the Kolyma. The prisoners were so famished that at a Zarosshy Spring they ate the corpse of a dead horse which had been lying dead for more than a week, and which it not only stank but covered with flies and maggots. At Utiny Goldfields the zeks ate half a barrel of lubricating grease, brought there to grease the wheelbarrows. At Mylga they ate Iceland moss like the deer. And when the passes were shut off by snowdrifts, they used to issue 3½ ounces of bread a day at the distant goldfields, without ever making up for previous deficiencies. Multitudes of goners, unable to walk by themselves, were dragged to work on sledges by other goners, who had not yet become quite so weak. Those who lagged behind were beaten with clubs and torn by dogs. Working in 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, they were forbidden to build fires and warm themselves. The beginning of the war shook the archipelago chieftains. The course of the war at the very start was such that it might likely have led to the breakdown of the entire archipelago, and perhaps even to the employers having to answer to the workers. As far as one judge from the impressions of the zeks from various camps, the course of events gave rise to 2 different kinds of conduct among the bosses. Some of them, those who were either more reasonable or perhaps more cowardly, relaxed their regime and began to talk with the prisoners almost gently, particularly during weeks of military defeats. They were unable, of course, to improve the food or the maintenance. Others who were more stubborn and more vicious began, on the contrary, to be even stricter and more threatening with the 58s, as if to promise them death before liberation. And in some camps, sensing intuitively the direction of future policy, they began to isolate the 58s from the non-political offenders in compounds guarded with a particular strictness, put machine guns up on the watchtowers, and even spoke thus to the zeks who had formed up. "You are hostages!" From the first days of the war, everywhere in the archipelago, on opening the packages of mobilization instructions, they halted all releases of 58s. There were even cases of released prisoners being sent back to camp while on their way home. In Ukhta on June 23rd, a group released was already outside the perimeter waiting for a train when the convoy chased them back and even cursed them. "It's because of you the war began." Karpunich received his release papers on the morning of June 23rd, but had not yet succeeded in getting through the gatehouse when they coaxed them out of him by fraud. "Show them to us." He showed them and was kept in camp for another 5 years. This was considered to mean until special orders. When the war had already come to an end, in many camps they were forbidden even to go to the classification and records section and ask when they would be freed. The point was that after the war there were not enough people for a while, and many local administrations, even if Moscow allowed them to release prisoners, issued their own special orders so as to hold onto manpower. Here's what the wartime camp was. More work and less food, and less heat and worse clothes, and ferocious discipline, and more severe punishment. And that still wasn't all. For the 58s, the wartime camps were particularly unbearable because of their pasting on second terms, which hung over the prisoners' heads worse than any axe. The security officers, busily engaged in saving themselves from the front, discovered in well-set-up backwaters and backwoods, in logging expeditions, plots involving the participation of the world bourgeoisie, plans for armed revolts and mass escapes. Such are the forms into which the islands of the archipelago hardened. But one need think that as it hardened it ceased to exude more metastases from itself. In 1939, before the Finnish War, Gulag's alma mater, Solovki, which had come too close to the west, was moved via the northern sea route to the mouth of the Yenisei River and there merged into the already created Norlag, which soon reached 75,000 in size. So malignant was Solovki that even in dying it threw off one last metastasis. And what a metastasis! The archipelago's conquest of the unpeopled deserts of Kazakhstan belongs to the pre-war years. That was where the nest of Karaganda camps swelled like an octopus, and fertile metastases were propagated in Zhezkazgan with its poisoned cuprous water, in Mointy and in Balkhash, and camps spread out over the north of Kazakhstan also. New growths swelled in Novosibirsk province, the Marinsk camps, in the Krasnoyarsk region, the Kansk camps and Krasleg, in Khakassia, in Buryat Mongolia, in Uzbekistan, even in Gornaya Shoraya. Nor did the Russian north, so beloved by the archipelago, end its own growth. End of Part 3, Chapter 4.